Fastyr Mie, hello and welcome to this edition of Agenda. I'm Ewan Gorn. Why join a union? The question we put to representatives of Prospect, Unite and the NASUWT on this show. We consider the impact of COVID-19 on workers' rights, changing perceptions of unions and what challenges there are facing employees across the Isle of Man. We also touch on the subject of zero-hour contracts, government relationships and looking after the social welfare of members. The pandemic has been a trying time for many, with workers in either transport, retail, education, anywhere along the COVID frontline being praised for their efforts through a very difficult situation. But unions warn there are threats to their rights from employers in terms of holidays and work expectations, etc. They argue this has drawn a focus on the importance of being represented in the workplace to fight against what they term as unfair unilateral decisions. So, should people join unions then? A question I put to Mick Hewer from Prospect, Debbie Halsall from Unite and Geraldine O'Neill from the NASUWT.
From our point of view, over the last 18 months, apart even from the pandemic, we've seen a huge increase as well, because our members who normally would be not the most active members have become quite active and supportive because we have had major issues to solve in our area of education. So I think people are beginning to realise, certainly, you know, as professions as well, apart from other frontline workers, how important it is to have that collective representation, as Debbie said, because as a collective group and bargaining and discussions with government and employers, whether they be private actually or public, you've got a much stronger voice together, and it enables people to speak out about what they would be afraid actually to tackle on their own, that they have a representative that can, if necessary, and it is sometimes necessary, protect them from perhaps an employer that is not the most cooperative. It is really, as Debbie said, young people though really need to understand the importance of being in a union to have those rights that we just accept today as part of a normal working life.
Well, Mick, I'll draw you in on that.
I think the history of the trade union movement maybe isn't taught as much and as well as it could be, and that's partly our fault and partly the education system, I suppose, history wise. But we're certainly, as colleagues here have said, we're as relevant, if not more relevant today and needed than we've ever been, particularly on the back of the pressures that have occurred through the COVID pandemic. And that's resulted in a number of people seeing their terms and conditions unilaterally changed, the working hours unilaterally changed. And it's not right. And we fully understand that as a collective, people needed to change the working patterns. But there was very little consultation in some areas, more in others. But I do think that people do and should join a trade union today for the protection that it offers. And like Geraldine said, we can raise issues that individuals feel they can't raise on their own because of bullying and intimidation. And that does happen. That's just strong words, but people are bullied in the workplace and they are intimidated in the workplace. We've got whistleblowing policies out there that, quite frankly, aren't fit for purpose. And that was borne out in the report.
They're under review
recently from Tynwald, which is, as far as I'm aware, still got to be debated in Tynwald and hasn't been given time for proper discussion.
Well, let's keep talking about the pandemic if we can then. Mick, you raised some particular issues about unilateral actions there and their effect on terms and conditions and pay. I'll go back to you, Debbie. I mean, what have your members noticed the most out of COVID? What's been the most significant change that's happened?
I think the biggest significant change that our members have seen is they've gone above and beyond, I think, vocationally in the jobs they actually do, and with no reward. And by I mean reward, I don't mean that financial side, I mean a thank you. And I think that's missing. I think if you look at the island and the luxury that we have at this moment in time to the adjacent island across, we basically have that freedom. And I think it basically needs to be recognised. So from somebody who who sweeps the streets to the shopkeeper, right through education, from the health services, everywhere. They've been an integral cog in keeping this island very safe. And I think there's never been more time for people to recognise that. And more, as Mick has just made reference to, it's an election year. and people now need to start questioning what have their MHK done for them, because as far as I can see, they're all jumping on the bandwagon now to saying, I'll do this and I'll do that. But where have you been for the last 4.5 years?
So what do you need them to do? What are the outstanding issues for employment relations then that they haven't got to grips with in the past 4.5 years?
I would say that, you talk about good industrial relations, that needs to be paramount. As a trade union, we shouldn't be just going into a room and they've tick-boxed a box and said, we've had a negotiation, or we've spoken to the trade unions. That's not what it's about. You start from the beginning. And basically that's something that's never happened.
I think as well, though, what we've discovered through the re-establishment of the Industrial Relations Forum last year, that there is, a tendency to look at that, as Debbie says, as a tick box exercise. We don't want to be a talking shop. We wanted to have influence on negotiations and consultation with government. I mean, the issues that we've seen in our profession is obviously, because of isolation and not being able to get across to see families, etc., it's been punitive on our members as government employees, stuck to term time, etc. And we need to look at how we view sickness absence, that it is not sickness absence in the normal terms, that it is, we're going through a world pandemic. So there have to be allowances, new ways of looking at that if we're going to continue to attract people to come and live on the Isle of Man, because otherwise, to be quite honest, they leave and they won't stay here, because we're going to have procedures in place. It's happening in the UK. We're not following the best models, and we certainly are not looking at the effects of long COVID either, I don't think, seriously enough. So, in relation to the public service as such, we are the people that have kept the island running through the pandemic at every single level. So we need to have more, what's the word for it? Not just lateral. It is lateral, is it? Lateral thinking rather than tunnel thinking, where we're looking at these things, and looking at how we make this better for our workforce here, because there's no reason. We're a very wealthy jurisdiction, and it is not acceptable to say we don't have the money. There's no way that we've been affected in the same way financially as the UK. There is a lot of money on this island, and we need to look at what we want to do for the future and how we protect and how we go forward with our island for everybody.
Well, some would argue that actually those particularly employed by government have been extremely lucky not to feel the ill effects of those like the self-employed and those who don't have that representation. I mean, what do you say to that?
If you say they've been lucky, I would say that, they've been. We'll go back to when the schools were closed. There was a decision made because of the Kent variant. So some of our members who have children were told, they were given 3 options because they couldn't go to work. You either take annual leave, you go unpaid, or you pay us hours back. Now, at that time, that was the options they were given. And that was unfair, given the fact they'd worked through 2 already lockdowns. And that was their time of need. They wanted help, they needed support for the childcare facilities, and they weren't given it at the time. And we obviously went into lengthy discussions, and basically we had resolution at the end of it. But that's not something that should have happened. So while I say, self-employed, albeit they were given MIRA and other workers were given salary support, that at the time wasn't given. So it's not a case of was luck. They actually worked all the way through it. And I'm not saying it's easy to sit at home and do work from home, because it's not. But there were options that was never actually given to our members, which was very frustrating, considering.
Sorry, Mick. Yeah,
I think one of the dangers as well, generally wise, is that people focus on government workers, and there's an awful lot of our members out there that aren't government workers that also worked all the way through the pandemic and all of the grief and the angst that caused them. So I don't want people to get focused on government, because I think that the perception is, particularly from myself, as far as myself and Debbie are concerned, aimed towards us, is that we represent government workers, and we don't. Yeah. We represent every worker on the island that's a member of our union, whichever union that may be.
Yeah, I totally agree that we shouldn't be focusing on government, and that's why I'm saying it's not just government. However, what we're talking about is workers. The really dangerous thing is to divide and rule. This is not about dividing and rule. Frontline workers, whether they're Government employees, our frontline workers at every level, as I've already said, kept the Isle of Man going. So you can't have your cake and eat it and say, oh, you're very lucky because you had a job. Well, if you didn't have teachers or support staff or caretakers or cleaning ladies working in a school, then your children wouldn't be able to be in there. You wouldn't be able to go to these jobs in the private sector. So, you know, it works both ways. So it should not be a situation where we're saying, it's either us or them. It's all of us, and we're all the workforce, and that's what we need to look at. But the Isle of Man government is responsible for policies and implementation for the whole of the workforce, because that is really what determines the industrial relations on the Isle of Man.
Well, let's talk about those policies then next, because we obviously want to talk about what you guys think could be done to improve things. So you've talked about the fear about the unilateral changes that are under COVID. Now, let's look forward. What are what? It's a bit of an arbitrary number, but 3 of the most important things to get right for the next administration when it comes to employment rights and those related issues. Who wants to go first?
Consultation.
Go on, Mick. Yeah.
Consultation.
Yes. And communication.
And communication. And I've got to say, from my perspective and my involvement, it's been pretty good. Consultation, negotiation. But I am aware Geraldine has got some significant problems in education, in that there's a resistance from certain areas within the Department of Education to recognise NASUWT.
So why is that, Geraldine?
Well, unfortunately, we have a code of practice, you know, and if a code of practice is actually being implemented as it should be fair and transparent for everybody. If you are a member of a nationally recognised union for a group of workers, then that should be automatic recognition. If we're going with the voluntary aspect of the code of practice, which is that you recognise, and that's the way we would expect a positive employer to engage with the trade union. However, what we have in the Isle of Man, and I have to say things, and I do say it all the time, have improved for us. However, there is this residue of, you know, looking after certain people and not others. And we need to get out of that, I think, in the Isle of Man government in general.
Is that because there are so many teaching unions? And you mentioned divide and rule before. Is it an element of that?
Well, there are a certain number of teachers' unions, but we are the majority of both. We represent the majority of teachers and lecturers on the Isle of Man. You have 2 leadership unions then, and they are, you know, quite small in comparison to us, and 1 other union, and then you have a college union. It is true we have more unions, but that shouldn't be. Actually, a good trade union representative should want to see as many trade union representatives at the collective bargaining
Does that not dilute the message, though?
No, it shouldn't do.
I think it strengthens. I think it strengthens the message when you've got a collective, multifaceted trade union forum, and basically we all say the same thing.
Yes.
So we don't pick and choose what we want to dip in and out. We basically stand together. And I think that's the whole point of trade unions. We stand together shoulder to shoulder.
Yes.
And that's moving forward in the momentum of what we've got. You talk about what does the future look like. We want to future-proof services. We want to basically be proactive. That's what we do. We sit and we have them consultations. We have the negotiations. Some departments you're pushing on an open door. Unfortunately, for other trade unions, not myself and Mick, we seem to have the ability to do that, but for some trade unions that doesn't really happen, and we don't understand why. Hence the reason we all come together.
You're listening to Agenda on Manx Radio. You may have noticed that unions have been active in the media about a host of issues within the last several years, but does that help them or harm them? A question I put to Debbie Halsall from Unite.
You've just got to say whatever, and from a member-led trade union, I facilitate a voice. And if they're not getting heard, then I can and I will be heard. And it's not a case, as Geraldine says, we're not there to bang a drum. I think people have this mindset of what a trade union is and the need to move forward. And I think whether you work in the private sector or the public sector, we're willing to work alongside every employer. But if you try to change their terms and conditions, or you try to do something like consultation and negotiation, we will be there and we will protect our members. That has been seen and demonstrated this last year when we've had to come out publicly over certain members who were treated very shockingly, which we had to go through that judicial process. And these are the things. But at the end of these processes we go through, what is being lost is the member is actually still employed, whether that be through a tribunal and decisions being made, that they are still hurt by the action of the employer. So we try to stave off that. We try to have that open, honest conversation before we get to them processes. But we will. We will go there without a shadow of a doubt. But that's not what it's about. We're trying to have that good working relationship with that Industrial Relations Forum. It's a multifaceted trade union, and everybody or every trade union will have different things that they'll bring to the table. It'll be brainstormed, we'll move forward and we'll have resolution. And that's what it's about. Take it as a very good opportunity that we're there to work in partnership. But we will not be brought in on the end and said, that's a tick box, we've engaged with the unions, because that's not fair.
Could I just go in on the back of that, just going back a couple of steps, to the perception of what a traditional trade union is and does, maybe needs to change a little bit, because I can tell you now, I've got more and more people coming into my office who are members of Prospect, but are coming into the office to seek advice on social issues, not necessarily work-related issues.
Mental health
they want
issues.
To mental health issues. They want to know about benefits, because they can't find the stuff on the websites.
Do you think they come to you because they know you represent their interests and want to help them?
I think they do, yes. That's one of the reasons. I think the other reason is
there's a gap,
because
really.
there's a gap. People come into us and they'll say that they've tried to make contact with different organisations, particularly within government, and they've either not understood the advice that they've been given, or they've not been able to get answers to the questions that they're asking, or they've just been referred to, it's on the website. Now that's wrong. People should be able to go down to the social security office, as it was now, and sit in there and actually speak to somebody who will spend an hour and a half with them, filling in the forms, going through what the questions are, making sure that they've got all the relevant paperwork they need to go with. We're doing that now.
Yeah, we're doing everything now. We're doing counselling, we're doing mental health advice, we're helping with all of these issues, because the gaps, they are not being provided by the agencies that should be providing them. So, you know, I love Debbie's word, multifaceted. Well, that's what we've become, you know, a voice on everything. We're the kind of centre of information for our members.
We're dealing with social issues.
And that was the question, one of the very first questions you asked, what do we do as a trade union? Well, we're that support worker, we are the liaison officer with HR and departments, we are the person who basically liaises with social security, with benefits office, with tax, with all these different things. We are the person who will pick that, whether it be a crisis team or whoever, we are the people who do all them things. So that's what the trade union is at the moment, isn't it?
We're social workers that specialise in employment legislation at the end of the day. That's what we've become. And
then we're caseworkers, where there is, you know, an individual issue, and they can be very, very complicated. And from our viewpoint, and I don't know if it's the same for Mick and Debbie, but because of COVID, we have a full-time caseworker workforce who support us, but because of COVID, they obviously can't come here. So I've had to man the breach there and do a lot more of that work, which is actually quite demanding at all levels. And, you know, we're actually providing the government with a service, in fact, by acting as caseworkers there and doing all of that work. That sometimes I think is possibly lost on them. And they need to sort of have a little bit of a reappraisal of how important that work is, especially in this crisis, because having Zoom meetings or whatever, a representation is, you know, okay on a certain level. But as Mick said, and Debbie, if you're dealing with very, you know, stressed or mental people who have got mental health issues or whatever, and you're representing them, they need a physical person in the room. And, you know, Debbie was talking about this earlier. when we go into things, we're told like you can have one trade union representative, but you'll have a HR person and you'll have someone who represents the employer. But I mean, we've had to actually, I mean, they have agreed it, but we've had to actually really ask to be there as well as the person on the screen, and we're not allowed to speak. I'm not sure that that's really, fair or just. I really think that, and often connections are not that good, so therefore there's that problem. So the person in the room who's there, as a physical support for the member should actually be able to communicate with that member as well in an employment situation, when we're doing this kind of thing virtually. So this whole pandemic has raised a whole load of issues for us, and it's raised huge workload issues for us as individuals, never mind for our members.
People often, maybe incorrectly or correctly, perceive the unions as fighting nowadays more for the existing rights that we have achieved rather than necessarily for new benefits or rights. There are conversations about things like 4-day working weeks and longer weekends, changes to hours. Is there anything on the horizon you think that unions should in fact be fighting for the benefit of their members that we don't currently have, away from the working within the forum, more sort of things to do with working hours, things to do with pay?
0-hour contracts, how about that?
Yeah, I've just got that down there.
Absolutely shocking.
So getting rid of 0-hour contracts, to be precise. You
look at that, and I was asked the question because I went and spoke at the AGM for the Manx Labour Party, and that was one of the questions I was asked. What did I think of them? And I don't agree with them. If it's for a pop-up shop in TT week, obviously that's fine, but for somebody who uses them projectedly all the time, and basically you've got a person who can't get on the property ladder, who can't basically claim benefits, so they're lost. Yeah. And they're literally walking a line, and all I make the summary of, they walk a fine line of disciplinary. Because if you don't toe the line, you're basically not getting any hours. Then you have to go through a process of maybe 6 weeks before you can claim a benefit. In the meantime, that's pushing people into poverty. And constantly. That is one of the things that... Don't get me started, because I could speak forever on this.
I was going to jump in on the 0-hour contracts because actually I've had experience as an employer using 0-hour contracts, and I use them for students in particular who were backwards and forwards off the island, and during summer when they were back, they would come into work, say, I'm back, I want to work for the summer for you. And so they were contracted, but they dipped in and out. They had complete freedom of choice as to what hours they could do. I would say, can you do A, B, C and D? And they would say, well, I can do A and I can do D, but I can't do the rest. Where it becomes a huge problem is when it's abused. How can you have somebody employed on a 0-hour contract who's regularly working 35 hours, full-time hours, day in, day out, and have done for well over a year, and I can give shed loads of examples, as can Debbie, of employers that have got people on 0-hour contracts working full-time.
So how do you deal with it?
Well, that's the issue, isn't it? How militant do you want us to become? We try and do it through negotiation, but it's abused, which takes us right back to your question earlier about what do we want to see, or what do we want to see in people's manifestos?
Well, do you have to be more militant then?
I think we will do eventually.
It would be good, though, to get the Isle of Man government not to use 0 contract. That would be a good example. They use a lot of it.
We went in front of the committee. I went and done a presentation in front of the 0-hour committee, and basically the recommendations came from that. Yeah, we'll still carry on. But you've got quite a few employers on the Isle of Man, obviously I won't name, who used and abused their position, and then when COVID hit, they basically threw them all away. Yet these people had worked long, some of them 8 hours, and what actually has resulted from that is they've all come together. They've all come together and saying this is not acceptable anymore. Because you can have as many companies out there as you want, but unless you've got a worker providing that service, you've got nothing.
Well, how do you deal with this? Because as in Mick's case, the example he used, that suited the situation. How do you distinguish between that instance and people who abuse?
Needs to be tightened up so that when the likes of myself or Debbie go into an employer and say, employee A is clearly working full-time hours or clearly working part-time regularly, the 0-hour contract needs changing to give them some form of protection rights at an earlier stage.
So who makes that decision? A government worker or?
Government need to.
They legislate. Employment legislation. You need employment legislation to protect the workers.
Yeah. And I don't think that Tynwald have got the willpower to push that through. And I think that's why the results came out from the 0 hours contract consultation period that they did, because there wasn't the will going into that consultation from government to change.
That's all from this programme. Thanks there to Mick Hewer from Prospect, Debbie Halsall from Unite and Geraldine O'Neill from the NASUWT. We'll be back with more from Agenda soon, and you can listen again to this edition online via the Manx Radio website or through Spotify. But for now, Guramayu and goodbye.